It's good to be back. And today, I'll be teaching on question 60 of the Shorter Catechism. This question can be found in Trinity Hymnal, as always, in the back of the book. Now, question 60 asks us this: how is the Sabbath to be sanctified? The answer: the Sabbath is to be sanctified by a holy resting all that day, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are lawful on other days, and spending the whole time in the public and private exercises of God's worship, except so much as is to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy. Now, there are two ways the divines teach us that we are to sanctify the Sabbath day. The first is by a holy resting all the day, and the second is by spending the whole time in public and private exercises in God's worship. Now, both parts go hand in hand in sanctifying the Sabbath. It would be impossible to truly uphold this commandment without both parts being observed. Now, I believe it is important for us to have a complete understanding of how we are to sanctify this day so that we don't fall into one of two extremes. The first extreme that we can fall into is that we see this day as a day of complete rest without any concern whatsoever in regards to worship. The second extreme that we can fall into is being so strict as to the adherence of the Sabbath that it turns the day of rest into a day of burden. So looking at that first extreme view, with all the things that we have to be concerned with every day, we can all appreciate having a day where we can just relax. Do nothing, sleep in, maybe not even change out of our pajamas, maybe play some video games, catch up on some old shows. Most people in this country in particular take Sunday to be that day. Even though in America, normally most people tend to have 2 days off, Saturday and Sunday. Saturday usually becomes a day where if there's any household chores or whatnot that need to be done, you're doing it on that day. So many take Sunday to be the day where they can just relax and do nothing and recharge. Now, as Christians, we do see Sunday as a day of rest, but it's not a day exclusively for rest. When God gave the Jews the seventh day of the week in the Old Covenant and us the first day of the week in the New Covenant, he did not give us this day just to rest. We do rest, but we are resting for a specific reason. Exodus 20, verse 10. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. This is the Lord's day. It is on this day that God gives us that we are to reflect upon him. Now, don't get me wrong, we ought to be meditating on God regularly, daily. But with work and all of our responsibilities, it can be difficult to do this consistently as we would like. But on this day, the Lord's day, this is our day to contemplate on God. We set aside our work obligations and all those things that normally distract us from worship, and we take the day to worship God privately and corporately. On this day, even those works which would not be a problem on other days are not to be done. Why? Because if this is a day set aside for God, our daily duties will impede us from full devotion to God today. Let's look at a passage of scripture in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 15 to 22. In those days, I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, and they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also, men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the door should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. Then I warned them and said to them, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember, O my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your loving kindness. So when you look at what the Jews were doing on the Sabbath, they weren't doing anything that was inherently sinful. The problem was that it was on the Sabbath that they sought to do that work. Now, many of us like to think that we are great at multitasking, that we can do 3 or 4 things all at the same time and get everything done perfectly and efficiently. The reality of the fact is that when you are trying to do multiple things at once, none of those things get done as well as they would if you just done it one right after the other. A person that is trying to squeeze work obligations and house chores and other tasks with worshiping God on the Sabbath will not fully be worshiping God as the individual who has set aside those things for the day. More times than not, what tends to happen if push comes to shove is worship will oftentimes be neglected for those other things. Those Jews in Nehemiah chapter 13 who were treading wine presses and selling food on the Sabbath, you know what they probably weren't doing? They probably weren't worshiping God while they were doing that. Something tells me that while they were treading wine presses, they probably weren't singing the Psalms or reading the Torah, as well as while doing these things. Now again, none of these things are in and of themselves sinful, but in doing them on the Sabbath, it kept them from performing the duties that they should have been performing on that day. I'll give you an example. When I'm in the office for work on Mondays and Fridays, there are a billion things that I have to get done. I got to do retirement analyses. I have to follow up with my clients. I have to be in meetings, and it feels like it's endless. And many times, a lot of my colleagues, while we're at work, they like to spend time talking about football games, basketball games, politics, and things like that. Now, these conversations aren't bad or necessarily wrong to even have. However, every time when I get sucked into one of these conversations, you know what ends up not happening? I end up not actually doing the work that gets me paid. There are plenty of times where I could have these conversations with my coworkers, but because it's keeping me from doing what I'm supposed to do when I'm in the office, it's best for me just to neglect, or not to neglect, but to set aside those things and wait for a better time, a more appropriate time. Likewise, we have 6 days to work and accomplish everything that we have to do. But on the Lord's Day, we ought to set aside those things so that we can focus on Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, in understanding the Lord's Day and understand that it is more than just a day of rest, we also ought to ensure that we are not creating undue burden upon ourselves and seeking to uphold this commandment. In Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28, it says this, "And it happened that he, Jesus, was passing through the grain field on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest. And he also gave it to those who were with him.' Jesus said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" So if there's one thing that the Pharisees were pretty good at, it's being overtly legalistic. They charged Jesus and the disciples with violating the Sabbath day by picking heads of grain. Now, Jesus sets them straight by demonstrating that works of necessity and works of mercy is not a violation of the Sabbath. Now, at the end of his discourse with the Pharisees, Jesus says something fascinating. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Now, I want you to think about these words again. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. What is Jesus trying to get at here? Our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Throughout the course of the week, we become so fixated with everything else that we may forget to reflect upon our great and awesome God. So God gives us the Sabbath day to rest from our work so that we may privately and corporately glorify God and enjoy him. The Sabbath was given in order to have us have one day where we can set aside the worries of our carnal pursuits and focus entirely on God, Thus, the Sabbath was made for us, and we were not made for the Sabbath. It was not created to be another burden, but rather to be a day where we reflect on him who removed our burdens. When we forget that, even if our intentions are good, we can cause a day that was meant to be joyous become distressing. Listen to this from Francis Turretin. Therefore, we do not think that in this cessation, believers are bound to Judaical precision, which some, more scrupulous than is just, maintain was not revoked, so that it is lawful neither to kindle a fire, nor to cook food, nor to take up arms against an enemy, nor to prosecute a journey begun by land or sea, nor to refresh themselves with innocent relaxation of the mind and body, provided they are done out of the hours appointed for divine worship, nor to have any diversion, however slight, to any things belonging to the advantages and emoluments of this life. For although this opinion bears on its face a beautiful appearance of piety, and undoubtedly with good intention, is proposed by pious men to procure the better sanctification of this day, usually so profaned, still it labors under grievous disadvantages, nor can it be retained without in this way bringing back into the church and imposing anew upon the shoulders of Christians an unbearable yoke, repugnant to Christian liberty and the gentleness of Christ, and opposed to the sweetness of the covenant of grace by agitating and tormenting the consciences of men through infinite scruples and inexorable difficulties, nearly driving to desperation. So God gave us this day to be free, to free us to worship him. Yet, how many times do we enslave ourselves with impossible to keep self-imposed, self-created rules in the name of hallowing the Sabbath? Now, I'm not saying that we ignore every restriction and do as we please, but I am saying that we should not be so strict that we fear even breathing wrongly in an improper fashion. The Sabbath day, the Lord's day, is not just a day of rest or just a day of worship. It is a day of rest in order that we may worship. It is a day set aside where we cease from our labors in order to rest and reflect upon God. It is on this day that we set aside those tasks that are not inherently sinful so that we can orient our minds towards Christ. Not only did he create us and give us life, he gave us a new heart and breathed in us new life. So this is what we ought to do in this day and reflect upon his goodness and his grace. That concludes the reading. Or not the reading, I guess, the catechism lecture. So let's rise